And I think the next guy on, who I will introduce, hopefully, as well as Maureen introduced me, I know nothing about him, but are you there, Gary?
Oh, hi, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Well, I'll introduce you. That's the end of my little piece. So follow on. It's Gary Patterson. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for the invitation, and my big thanks to New Europeans for all of the efforts that you continue to undertake to try to promote the rights of citizens on both sides of the new divide, as it were, in terms of Brexit throughout this whole process. And so I was very honoured to be asked tonight to come and give a little personal reflection on what freedom of movement has meant to me as an individual. So I think I'm perhaps one of the people that we often hear about from the Brexit side, who they're fighting for, which is the kind of so-called forgotten, the likes that Darren Grimes might talk about is saying like he's a kind of working class kind of background, and that somehow Europe doesn't relate to people from different backgrounds, that it's some sort of cosmopolitan bubble, that it's some sort of London-based experience. And I really want to counter that, because for me, I'm quite passionate to come from a working class background in the northeast of Scotland. I'm someone who has benefited from the European project in so many ways, and is someone who doesn't actually fit the stereotypical image of the globalization winners. So for me, I come from a very different background as a kind of working class kid from a care experience background in Dundee, post-industrial Scotland, the kind of post-Thatcher era, whereby my parents had maybe grown up in quite difficult circumstances and didn't necessarily have the same opportunities. What we would find if we actually break into the analysis is that many of the opportunities that they did manage to access were in many ways supported by European funding to local government in regions. But if we were to fast forward to some extent, I had been inspired to go back into education through community college. And as chance would have it, it seemed to be complete circumstance, but there was a MEP for Scotland who was more or less based in Angus, Ian Hudson. And he sponsored a trip from Angus College, where I was studying, to the European Parliament more or less every year. So I was studying, really doing my intermediates at college first of all, and then doing my hires, because of many difficulties that I had experienced as a care experienced, homeless experienced young person who basically decided to go back into education and get the grades that I thought that I should have had. And so I'd never been abroad before. I'd never been actually, I'd only been to Europe 3 years. Sorry, I'd been to London 3 years before I'd actually went to Brussels. But on this trip, we went to the European Parliament, and for me, it was an extremely amazing experience to see this vast world beyond the life that I was experiencing in Scotland and in the northeast of Scotland, to see. I remember a moment that was really important to me, sitting in the European Parliament and listening to people speaking in different languages and talking about the challenges that we're facing. It was, be it climate change, or be it issues of inequality, or just wider challenges that we're facing. To me, I found it completely amazing to see someone speaking in German and someone then responding in French. And listening on my headphones, I can hear that we're talking about issues of how we come together and solve the issues that we're facing. So I think from that moment, I really fell in love with the whole concept of Europe as something that brings people together. The idea of Europe as a kind of, as even Boris Johnson said, a noble project, something that says that together we share certain values and we have a common destiny, and we want to build something together. So this was pre-Brexit times. This was around about 2011, 2012, so not quite where we got to. From that moment, I really became inspired to go to university. So I became the first person in my family to do that. And at university, I got very involved in student activism, and citizenship was one of the main issues as well that I was really involved in. So I was vice president eventually of the National Union of Students. I was the president of my student union, and I made a real effort to get involved in things like the Erasmus Student Network. I made a real effort to work with the European Parliament office in Scotland, with the European Commission office, and basically we were promoting all of the opportunities that perhaps maybe people from my background, not enough of them had the opportunity to access or didn't have enough support to access. So I was very passionate about the idea of promoting internationalization within education, promoting international opportunities. And I was witnessing, working in the higher education sector, I was witnessing the benefit of Europeans coming to live in Glasgow, where I went on to study at the University of Strathclyde, or our students going out abroad to other parts of Europe. As president of the student union, which was 2014 to 2016, I ran a campaign which was funded by the Scottish Government, which was to take young people from disadvantaged and underrepresented backgrounds out for many study trips to Prague, to France, to other destinations. And this campaign is still running. I'm pleased to say it's called Strathclyde Goes Global. So we were taking people who didn't benefit necessarily from Erasmus, people who had caring responsibilities or were mature students or came from working class backgrounds. And when I've been talking about Erasmus in previous weeks about how it's a vital project that needs to be saved, one of the things I've been keen to accentuate in my argument is that to say that Erasmus wasn't perfect either, and that it was also difficult for some people to access. But the answer to that is not then to say, well, we're going to provide an alternative scheme which sends people to Beijing and New York with less funding that was in place before that. But those international mobility schemes, whilst they didn't necessarily work for everyone, there was a lot that was provided for people that is forgotten about when we talk about Erasmus. And it's this point that I want to emphasize as well, is that I was never on an Erasmus exchange, but I regard myself as part of the Erasmus generation because I was a beneficiary and an organizer of several Erasmus funded projects. And I think that's very key to note that Erasmus wasn't just something where you send people away for 6 months or you receive people, as valuable and as wonderful as that had been. But actually it was down to things like funding language provision within schools and local authorities, funding youth mobility projects, actually funding projects which had an internationalization dynamic, which didn't actually involve physical mobility. It could be connection across borders. I witnessed when I went to Belfast, young people who were involved in community building between the community divides that existed, and they were funded on European voluntary scheme funding, and that's now obviously part of Erasmus Plus. So one of the big passions that I got involved in was the Model European Union network. I went to Strasbourg, really had never really been even given, I don't think I'd ever given a public speech before I actually spoke in one of the plenary chambers in the European Parliament. We were given training, we were taught about European politics, we were taught how to understand legislatures and how to be active citizens. And so through this dynamic of Erasmus mobility, I got really involved in European citizenship back home in Scotland and internationally. I attended several more MEU conferences and began to form a network of friends and colleagues who I could really see were, you know, just in the same way as I had friends back home that I would love to catch up with in Glasgow or Edinburgh or even in England. You know, my friends who were in Paris or in Berlin or in Warsaw, we shared the same ideas, we shared the same sense of humanity, of citizenship. We really believed that we were one. When you hear Theresa May talk about if you're a citizen of nowhere, you're irrelevant, well, I thought that was ludicrous. As much as I find it ludicrous when people suggest that our solidarity can only be within the confines of these islands, when I have friends across Europe, I care about what's happening in their countries. I care about their issues, and we are together as friends. So I was honoured to become president of the network that organised those MEUs, and I'd established my own conference in Scotland. And we, for example, in Scotland, had received over 100 young people over 3 years, in which we'd had from locally in Scotland or had come from other parts of the EU. And we really believed in this idea that we're promoting citizenship, that we're trying to build bridges across Europe. And if we can empower young people to understand how political systems work, that we could try to shape something for the positive. So again, this all was possible because of freedom of movement. It started to take a different personal turn. Obviously, having my friends was something wonderful. But then actually in my MEU, just about a year and a half ago, I ended up at the same MEU, I should say. I met my now girlfriend, who is Parisian, and I'm actually in Paris right now, which softens the blow a little bit tonight. You know, I really now, I'm not only living freedom of movement as an idea that I've always supported, but I'm now in my personal life connected beyond borders and will forever think beyond borders because my life is connected in that way. But I also, at that same conference, found my way towards the College of Europe, which I'm now studying at as well. So I continued from Strathclyde on to Glasgow to do a master's looking at international relations. And now I'm studying European international relations and diplomacy at the College of Europe, which is a very special institution connected to the formation of the EU. It was more or less created within the same room at the same time as the EU, as an institution that should bring together young people from no matter their backgrounds. And as I said this year for our opening remarks, that that generation that put down guns and picked up pens had decided that, you know, we need to work together to try and create something better. And perhaps there's been an element of complacency over previous generations, that we've lost the understanding of how special those connections were, and how they were formed after that difficult period. So now I'm at a point where I am currently living in Bruges, and I'm still, even despite Brexit, I kind of am effectively one of the last that have managed to get through the new barriers that have been in place, which also poses questions for me, because I don't know what I can do for a career over here, if I want to stay here or if I want to go home. I have challenges in terms of having my partner and having to try to get past the new immigration regime that's going to be in place. But through all of those difficulties, I'm still really, no matter how sad I am tonight about the new regime that's taken place, I'm eternally grateful for the opportunities that I had. And I honestly cannot say that 10 years ago I would be working in Tesco's in Dundee thinking that all of a sudden I would be studying and working in international politics. It would not be, would just not factor into my thinking at all. And throughout that was a combination of the benefits of the EU in terms of the free market, free movement, in terms of the funding that was provided to support regional provision of education. For example, for many years, college funding in Scotland had been directly supported by EU regional funding. So really, I quite passionately believe myself as a kind of as someone from the Maastricht generation, and someone that's benefited immensely from the opportunities of Europe. And I've seen people who are older than me, generations like those that I've spoken tonight, that have even benefited even further. And it's just it's an immense point of sadness that we're losing this. But I think it's really important that we try to take a positive angle, and we try to find a way to move forward. We need to look at what are the methods that we can undertake to try to keep the bonds there at the moment. I know that some people will be tempted to focus on the fastest way back into Europe, and of course, being in Scotland, I have my own kind of view on how that could be quickly achieved for us, or more so. But it's a simple fact that we don't have an election in Westminster until 2024. So we have 4 years until there's another election. At that point, there may be an opportunity to have a rejoin to Europe. I'm a bit sceptical of that, frankly, and the comments today from Keir Starmer were not very encouraging in that sense. And so therefore, I think the biggest objective that we have in the here and now is to make sure that we do not lose the bonds that we have, that we don't diverge in terms of law. That may happen, but we don't diverge in the social sense, and that's crucial. And I do believe that that is the reason why programs such as Erasmus are coming under attack, whereas programs such as Horizon 2020 are not coming under attack. So it's quite obvious that the UK does not want the next generation of young Europeans to in the UK to grow up with that idea. They don't want them to think that they are young Europeans, and they do. They're very happy enough for us to take a short holiday, but we're not to be there long term. We're not to think of our European friends as our fellow citizens. And anything that we can do to counter that is hugely important. So one of the areas that I've been pushing on this in Scotland as an activist on EU citizenship is that I think the Scottish government, if it cannot get around Erasmus barriers from London, should be inspired by what's happening in Belfast, whereby they're continuing to have access to Erasmus through the Irish government. Obviously, we're not going to be able to force our way into Erasmus if the UK vetoes Scottish young people's aspirations. But I do think that there's scope for individual citizens, for organisations, and for governments at the city, sub-state or national level to undertake bilateral ties with other organisations. And New Europeans will be key to that because it has a presence in the UK and across Europe. So the efforts that are being undertaken by those organisations should really be supported as much as possible, even if it's not purely focused on the domestic debate. And I think perhaps those that support Remain almost find themselves in the same way as people that had supported a preference in Scotland in 2014, who have spent the last 6 years basically trying to find our feet in terms of the future. I think that's now the same process that's going to happen in the UK. And it's really important that as part of that, that we don't draw into ourselves too much, that we try to keep the ties that are there. We really make sure that people don't lose out on the opportunities as much as possible. And I would really encourage, certainly at the political level, that we try to undertake bilateral funding with other governments to try to circumvent some of the barriers that are being pursued by the UK, or if organisations or individuals can do anything to bring people together, then I think that'll be vitally important. So that's my journey, really, from through education through to Erasmus Plus and European funded opportunities. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing the rest of your remarks tonight. And I'll just say that tonight I'll have a little Erasmus beer, and I'll be thinking of all of the loss that we're going to have tonight, but I'm also determined that we will continue to strive forward to forge a path back. Thank you.